The disappearance of the Sodder children. I've always been obsessed with unsolved mysteries, the kind that gnaw at your mind and leave you with 100 questions, but no answers. That's why I found myself standing outside the dilapidated remains of the Sodder family home in Fayetteville, West Virginia. The house had burned down nearly 80 years ago on Christmas Eve 1945. 5 of the Sodder children vanished in that fire, or so the official story goes. But the more I dug into the case, the less it made sense, and the deeper the mystery became. As a freelance journalist, I had written about plenty of strange cases before, but none had unsettled me like this one. The Sodder case felt different, darker. After weeks of research, I decided to visit the site to see if standing where it all happened might bring some clarity. I stood in front of the empty plot where the Sodder house once stood, now overgrown with weeds. The area was eerily quiet, except for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. The faint smell of smoke seemed to hang in the air, even though there hadn't been a fire here in decades. A cold shiver ran down my spine, but I ignored it, pulling out my notebook and phone to document my visit. According to the official reports, the Sodder family was asleep on that fateful night when the fire broke out. George and Jenny Sodder, along with 4 of their children, managed to escape. But 5 of the children, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, were never found. No remains, no bones, nothing. The authorities claimed they had perished in the fire. But how could an entire family of children vanish without a trace? I snapped a few photos of the site, trying to picture what it must have looked like back then. The more I thought about it, the stranger it seemed. The Sodder family had insisted for years that the fire wasn't accidental, that someone had deliberately taken their children. Witnesses had reported seeing the missing children in a car driving away from the scene that night, but no one had ever followed up on those leads. I crouched down by the edge of the plot, where the foundation of the house was still visible beneath the grass. I felt an odd urge to touch the cold stone, as though it might give me some connection to the past. As my fingers brushed the rough surface, a sudden feeling of unease swept over me. It was as if the ground beneath me was humming, vibrating with some unseen energy. I stood up quickly, shaking it off as nothing more than my imagination. I glanced around, my heart rate picking up for reasons I couldn't explain. The wind had stilled, and the air seemed to grow heavier. There was something about this place, something wrong. I had read stories about locations being haunted by the tragedies that took place there, but I didn't believe in that kind of thing. Not really. But then I heard it, a faint sound, almost like a child's laughter, drifting through the air. My blood ran cold. I froze, straining to listen, but the sound was gone as quickly as it had come. I stood there motionless, scanning the trees that bordered the property. The light was beginning to fade, casting long shadows that seemed to dance across the ground. My rational mind told me it was just the wind, maybe a distant bird call, but my instinct screamed at me to leave. Ignoring the rising fear, I turned back to my work. I had come all this way for answers, and I wasn't about to let a few eerie sounds scare me off. I began reviewing my notes, tracing the timeline of events once again, searching for something I had missed. But my focus was shattered by another sound, this time closer, a soft rustling in the weeds behind me. I whipped around, heart hammering in my chest, but there was no one there, just the empty plot and the wind. I exhaled slowly, feeling a wave of relief wash over me. "Get a grip," I muttered under my breath. But just as I turned back to my notes, I saw something out of the corner of my eye. A figure, small and shadowy, standing near the foundation. My breath caught in my throat as I looked directly at it. A child, maybe 6 or 7 years old, stood in the fading light. His clothes were tattered, his face pale and expressionless. He didn't move. He just stood there, staring at me with wide, empty eyes. "Hey!" I called out, my voice shaky, but the figure didn't respond. It simply turned and walked slowly toward the trees, disappearing into the shadows. Panic surged through me, and before I knew it, I was running after the child, my boots sinking into the soft ground as I chased him toward the tree line. "Wait! Come back!" I shouted, but my voice sounded hollow in the growing darkness. As I reached the edge of the trees, I stopped short, gasping for breath. The child was gone, vanished as if he had never been there. My heart pounded in my chest as I looked around frantically, my hands shaking. The air here felt colder, heavier, as though something was watching me from the darkness beyond the trees. I didn't want to admit it, but I was terrified. I had come to find answers about the disappearance of the Sodder children, but now I felt like I was part of the mystery. Something wasn't right. The island of doubt in my mind had now turned into an ocean of fear. Had I really seen the child, or was my mind playing tricks on me? I stumbled back toward the house site, my eyes darting nervously to the shadows around me. I wanted to leave, but some invisible force kept pulling me back. I needed to know the truth. That's when I saw them, 5 small figures standing at the edge of the property. They were just shadows in the fading light, but I knew what they were: the missing children. They stood there silently, watching me, their faces obscured by the gloom. My body went numb as the realization hit me. They had never left. They had been here all along, trapped in the place where their lives had been stolen. The air grew colder, and the figures began to fade, their outlines dissolving into the night. The whispers started then, faint, barely audible, like voices carried on the wind. "Help us!" I backed away slowly, my legs trembling, unable to tear my eyes away from the spot where the children had stood. I didn't understand what was happening, but I knew one thing for certain. The Sodder children hadn't just disappeared. They had been taken by something far worse than fire, and now they wanted me to know. I ran, leaving my notebook behind, fleeing back to the safety of my car. But even as I drove away, I could still hear their whispers in my head. "Help us." And deep down, I knew I never would. "Help us."